I'm very pleased that Dan was able to fit us into his busy schedule. I first heard Dan speak at the Rotary Club of LA last year, and he was so captivated and spoke so matter-of-factly from a place of neutrality on the topic of politics and election that I just had to ask him if he would be willing to speak to our club. Mind you, this was pre-national televised January 6 hearings and pre-2022 Supreme Court decisions. So back then it was hard to believe that the political climate could get more tense. Somehow there seems to be a new political bombshell every week. And as we are only 90 days from the midterm elections, Dan will help us sort the game of pickup sticks that is the world of politics. I will not read the entirety of his bio, which you can read on his website, but we'll point out that as Rotarians, we would find of great interest that he has served as an advisor to the William and Melinda Gates Foundation, the William and Flora Hewitt Foundation, and the Pew Charitable Trusts, among many others. Dan is a professor at the University of California, Berkeley's Institute of Governmental Studies, Go Bears, Pepperdine University's Graduate School of Public Policy, and the University of Southern California's Annenberg School of Communications, where he teaches courses in politics, communications, and leadership. Dan has also taught at the John F. Kennedy School of Government's Institute of Politics at Harvard University and George Washington's University Graduate School of Political Management. Previously, Dan worked on 4 presidential and 3 gubernatorial campaigns as one of California's leading political strategists. He served as the National Director of Communications for the 2000 presidential campaign of US Senator John McCain and was the chief media spokesman for California Governor Pete Wilson. Dan, I turn over the floor to you.
Oh, well, Salvador, thank you so much for that very kind introduction, and also for the invitation to be able to join all of you. One thing that Salvador left out of my biography is my own history with Rotary. In addition to the speech I gave to the Los Angeles chapter where Salvador and I first met, I've had the great honor and privilege of speaking over the years to many of your chapters, both here in Southern California and up in the Bay Area. But even before that, years and years ago, my uncle Kerry was the president for a long time of the Fox Point, Wisconsin Rotary Club. And so my very first opportunity to address a Rotary was more years ago than I care to admit, when I was a high school senior. And thanks to the generosity of the Rotary of Fox Point, I was able to go on to college. And so I have a tremendous debt to this organization and a tremendous admiration for Rotary and its members. So thank you all very much for having me with you today. Trying to make sense of the political landscape is probably a little bit more than we can pull off in the next 16 minutes, but I will do my best. And what I have learned from past opportunities to talk with Rotary is the best thing I can do is maybe talk a little bit short and leave more time for questions, for insights, for insults, whatever you choose, because I've found that with a smart, well-educated group like Rotaries tend to be, the conversation is what really gets more interesting. When Salvador first contacted me about speaking to your group just about a month ago, Joe Biden was struggling with historically low poll numbers and a legislative agenda that appeared to be dead in the water. And on the Republican side, Donald Trump's candidates had lost primaries in the state of Georgia and in other states around the country over the course of the spring. So it didn't really look like it was shaping up to be that great a year for either Joe Biden or for Donald Trump. So Salvador and I decided that the title for today's program should be Why This Wasn't the Midterm Election That Either Biden or Trump Wanted. Well, that was a month ago. And a month isn't just a lifetime in politics. It's 30 lifetimes in politics. And since we just came up with that title, recognizing what looked to be both Biden and Trump's very challenging political circumstances, a lot has happened. Not only has Biden passed bipartisan legislation on the computer chips and semiconductors, on veterans relief, on gun safety, and it appears this week on his seminal healthcare and climate bill. But we're also beginning to see significant downturns in the inflation that has really dragged down Biden's approval ratings over the last couple of years. On the Republican side, since those early challenges that Trump faced with his candidates, just over the last 8 days, Trump's candidates have achieved big primary wins in the state of Arizona last Tuesday and in my home state of Wisconsin just last night, in which the Trump-endorsed candidates for governors defeated fairly decisively the more traditional mainstream Republican candidates. And of course, the big news, as all of you are obviously very aware, was the FBI search at Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort on Monday. And we'll talk in just a minute, not just about the legal ramifications of the FBI and Department of Justice's search, but given the topic of today's conversation, the potential impact of that search on the midterm elections. So just to back up for just a moment, and I think most of you know this already, but just to, for clarity's sake before we go on, midterm elections in American politics require a much different formula for success than presidential elections. In presidential campaigns, the way to success is to persuade undecided voters, to take those voters in the middle, in between the political 40-yard lines, if you will, and move them horizontally in one direction or the other, toward one end zone or the other. But in midterm elections, because there tends to be less voter turnout and there tends to be less voter interest in the absence of a presidential campaign election on the ballot, midterms tend to be much less about persuading swing voters and much more about motivating the respective party bases. Now, Biden has had trouble with his party's base, with Democratic progressives, ever since he first entered the presidential campaign back in 2020. Young voters, voters from communities of color, and other progressives tended to be somewhat suspicious of him. And ultimately, as I know all of you remember, Biden achieved the Democratic nomination for president that year, not so much by winning those voters over, but rather because those voters were so concerned, those progressive voters were so worried about the prospect of another Trump presidency, having Donald Trump in office for another 4 years, that they decided that rather than following their hearts by supporting a more left-leaning candidate like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, that they would sort of suck it up and vote for the establishment candidate just to keep Trump out of the White House. So they've never been all excited about him. And that's created a real challenge for Biden in a midterm election, which really is all about motivating the party's base. Now, Trump, on the other hand, of course, is beloved by party conservatives. But over the last several months, it's appeared that he's been facing increased competition for the affections of his party's base, not just from Florida, primarily from Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, but from any number of other potential Republican candidates as well. So a month ago, they both looked like they might be having some trouble motivating their respective bases to turn out on election day, not so much for their own candidacy, because neither are on the ballot, of course, this year, but rather to motivate their preferred candidates. And right now, for reasons I mentioned just briefly earlier, and we'll dig into in a little bit more detail now, right now, Biden and Trump, improbably just a month or so later, are in a much better position to turn out their voters' most loyal supporters on election day. For Biden, it's the legislative accomplishments that I mentioned. And the one that stands out most, particularly for more liberal voters who've never really been all that excited about Trump, the key there is the climate change aspect of the bill that's moving through the House of Representatives this week. It's a lot smaller commitment to fighting climate change than the Democrats had wanted when this bill was first introduced back in 2020, early last year. But it is the largest commitment this country has ever made on this issue. And Biden's strategists, at least, believe that will be particularly helpful in turning out young voters. But the biggest political motivator of all for Joe Biden is not Biden himself, but rather the overturn of Roe versus Wade, which took place earlier this summer. And there's a lot of Democratic voters, particularly young voters, particularly young women, who've never been that excited by Joe Biden, but are extremely motivated by the overturn of Roe. And we're already seeing some evidence, most notably in the ballot initiative that was defeated in the state of Kansas last week, that young people and other Democratic progressives who aren't that thrilled with Joe Biden are sufficiently motivated by the removal of protections for reproductive rights at the national level to perhaps make this midterm election much more competitive than it originally been envisioned. And for Trump, not only has he been helped achieve primary wins for candidates for governor and for Senate around the country over the course of the spring and summer, but of course, as I mentioned briefly earlier, this FBI search on Monday, in addition to the potential legal and constitutional questions it raises, for the purposes of our conversation today, this could end up being the ultimate base motivator for Trump. We've already seen just over the last 36 hours just how angry and how upset and how motivated conservative Republicans are in reaction. Some might say an overreaction. We'll talk more about that later, to the FBI's search. And for Trump, who appeared that he was having trouble motivating his base over in recent months, this is really a gold-plated opportunity for him. One of the things that had created an opportunity for DeSantis and other Republican potential challengers to Trump is that there was a growing belief in the Republican Party, even among former Trump supporters, that Trump was spending too much time focusing on the past. And this is something that former Vice President Pence has been talking about as he's been out on the trail. And the thought among a lot of Republican Party regulars was, we like Trump, we respect him, we're grateful to him, but we really have to look to the future. And Trump, for any number of reasons, just simply wasn't able to let go of what he considered to be a robbery, a theft of the 2020 election. But what this FBI investigation appears to do, or the FBI search appears to do, is it moves Trump's complaints from the past into the present. And so a lot of those voters who were upset that he was talking about something that in their mind was 2 years old and not that relevant anymore, Trump can make largely the same complaints against the political establishment in Washington, but in a much more contemporary and current day fashion. And while it's always foolish to leap to conclusions just 36 hours after news is broken, it's fairly clear that Republicans seem much more motivated by this step than Democrats are. Now, of course, the big question is we don't know why the search took place. Neither Attorney General Garland nor FBI Director Wray, nor any representative from either of those two entities has talked in public as of yet about why the search took place. So right now we're only hearing one side of the story. But smart observers in both parties believe that Garland and Wray better have something pretty big here, because if it does turn out to be just an argument over whether certain amounts of certain papers and documents should have been designated as classified or not, that's not going to be enough to turn public opinion in their favor. We don't know when Garland is going to speak publicly. The only thing I can tell you with authority is that the Attorney General does not see his job as to win or lose elections or to unite or divide America. His job is to look into potential crimes. But until he or one of his representatives does speak, well, while this appears to be of great benefit to Trump and his supporters going forward, we really won't know until we hear both sides of the story. So where are we at this point, given all these unknowns? And then I'll wrap up and we'll turn this diatribe into an actual conversation. What do we know? We know, as I mentioned briefly earlier, that a century's worth of political history shows that the party that occupies the White House is almost always at a tremendous disadvantage in midterm elections. In fact, there's only been 3 midterms in the last 100 years in which the president's party gained seats rather than lost them. In 2002, Republicans gained seats under George W. Bush's presidency, primarily because the elections took place just a year after the terrorist attacks of 9/11, and those were issues that played very strongly in Bush and the Republicans' favor. 4 years earlier in 1998, Democrats gained seats during Bill Clinton's second term midterms, primarily as a result of what was perceived among swing voters to be Republican oversteps on the impeachment of Bill Clinton. And before that, before 2002 and 1998, you got to go back to 1934, to Franklin Roosevelt's first midterm elections, at the depths of the Great Depression, to find a president's party that had gained seats. So on balance, the Democrats start out in a hole. Voters are not particularly happy about the economy. Biden's approval ratings are down, and those historical trends work against them in a significant way. But given challenges that Republicans have had in terms of candidate recruitment and performance, it now looks as though the Senate might be up for grabs, which is a prediction not many analysts would have made even a year ago. And as I mentioned earlier, the overturn of Roe versus Wade does appear to have motivated Democratic voters in a way that most parties in power are not able to motivate their base in a non-election year. So all of this is a very long-winded way of saying, we have no idea what's going to happen in 90 days, Salvador. But as you watch those next 90 days as they unfold, what I would encourage you to do is watch to see whether Democrats can continue to use the Roe decision as a way to motivate their own most loyal supporters, whether the FBI search and investigation continues to motivate Trump supporters the way it has over the last couple of days. And ultimately, the absolutely unsatisfactory prediction I will make is that the party that does a better job of motivating its own base is the one that'll control Congress in January of 2023. And frankly, I don't have any better idea than any of you do as to which party that's going to be. So with that very unsatisfactory prediction and conclusion, we should turn this monologue into a conversation. And I'll be eager to try to answer as many questions as any of you'd like to ask with the time that's remaining. So again, thank you very much, not just for having me today, but thank you and your fellow Rotarians for giving me an opportunity many, many years ago that otherwise might not have been available to me. And finally, thanks to you as a club and as an organization for all the good work you do in your communities all across this country, particularly in times of such hyperpolarization and divisiveness. We need community groups like yours that pull us together rather than drive us apart. And so far more than anything else, let me thank you for your role in that unifying effort. We need it. So thank you very much.
Yeah, this is a interesting and a precious day to me. And I want to thank you so much, sir, for being here and sharing part of your knowledge. I wish I were there. We were there in person. I could talk to you for hours if you had the opportunity. But I'd appreciate your comments on, as we look at President Biden and where his ratings are, no matter how hard he worked. I mean, he's not been on the golf course. He's been just, even with COVID, he's had all these massive successes. And so I'd be interested in knowing how you feel about the elephant in the room. I think no matter what he does, I think it's the fact that his age, and then the potential for a Black woman to be president. I think that, that's really the elephant in the room that nobody's going to talk about. I'd like your comments.
Well, I think two very intelligent questions. And I agree with you, ma'am. I'd very much like to have this conversation in person. So we'll do our best to fill in the gaps until we can make that happen. So I think 2 points. Number one, there's no question that there's great concern among the electorate about Biden's age. And I think when you see poll numbers that show such a large number of Democrats saying that someone else should run for president, and this is not something you normally see, even when an unpopular president is going to midterms, you don't see these kind of numbers suggesting another candidate as a replacement. So I think his age is one of the things that's driving that restlessness, even among his most loyal supporters. I would say this though, excuse me. ultimately, I believe, is that voters were not down on Biden over the summer simply because of his age, but because of his age and what they saw to be an ineffective presidency. They didn't see him being able to accomplish very much. And so given the passage of the CHIPS Act, given the passage of the Veterans Relief Bill, given the climate change and healthcare legislation that's moving forward and other steps of progress, my guess is you'll see more and more voters, particularly in the Democratic Party, instead of saying, hey, he's too old, let's replace him, saying instead, hey, you know what, he's pretty old, but he knows what he's doing. And as long as his health holds up, maybe we do need to stick with him. The other point I'd add to that is Biden believes, and I think with some justification, that if Trump does run for president again, and let's agree that the chances of that dramatically increased over the last 36 hours, Biden believes that he is the best positioned Democrat to defeat Trump. I think if Trump were not to run for health or any other reasons, then I think the cry to replace Biden on the ticket would grow much stronger. But as long as Trump looks like the plausible Republican nominee, I think Biden will be able to bring most of those people back. To the second part of your question briefly, because I do see a lot of hands up. I'm not a name dropper. I wouldn't say that we're friends at all. We've just known each other for a long time. I met Kamala Harris when she was the deputy district attorney in San Francisco. And our governor, Gavin Newsom, at that point was on the public safety board getting ready to run for county supervisor for the first time. And Harris has been underestimated throughout her entire political career, during her time as district attorney, during her time as attorney general, during her time in the Senate. We can talk more about Harris before we close up if you like, but I think her greatest disadvantage is neither her gender nor her racial heritage. I think her biggest disadvantage is she's only the second vice president in the last half a century to have less Washington experience than the president. We as Americans, we tend to elect outsiders. Trump, Obama, Bush, Clinton, Reagan, Carter, all were relative newcomers to Washington, and all of them picked running mates who were more experienced in the way the Capitol worked. The only other vice president in the last 50 years who did not have as much Washington experience as their boss was Dan Quayle. And for those of you with long memories, you remember that Quayle was very harshly criticized. And I feel like Harris faces a similar challenge, not because she's not smart, not because she's not capable, but we've gotten used to over a half a century thinking of vice presidents as the wise old head who advises the president. And when the president's an old head, wise or otherwise, depending on your politics, we don't really know what to do with the vice president. And so whether Harris runs for president in 2024 or 2028, my own opinion, and I realize I say this as a white man, and so you can take me in context if you like, I don't think Harris's biggest challenge is either her gender or her racial heritage. I think rather it's convincing the body politic that she was able to contribute something during 4 or 8 years of a Biden presidency.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that's a much longer answer than I'd intended. That's what happens when you invite a professor. I like to say we talk in 90-minute sound bites, but those were 2 really good questions. So I'll try to be quicker on the others.
We appreciate so much your being with us. My question is, being a Wisconsinite, and Wisconsin having quite a history of interesting leaders from on both ends of the continuum, from La Follette to Joe McCarthy, all the way back. To what extent would you see Wisconsin being a bellwether in the presidential elections? To what extent can we look at Wisconsin as a reference, a good quality reference going forward?
Oh, it's a great question, and thank you for appealing to my cheesehead tendencies. And I'll resist I'll resist talking about the Green Bay Packers and stick to politics. But I think Wisconsin, for any number of reasons, has emerged as a real bellwether in American elections, the way a state like Ohio or a state like Florida once was for many years. I think one of the reasons that Wisconsin has emerged is not because it's so balanced politically, but because of our increased geographic split not just in the state of Wisconsin, but in this country, the rural-urban divide and the difference between the political attitudes of those who live in cities and suburbs versus those who live in ex-urban and rural America has never been greater. Democrats dominate the cities and the suburbs, Republicans, the outer lying areas and rural communities to such a degree that they almost balance each other off. And as you know, Dick, from your time in Wisconsin, the way that state's politics works is Democrats try to win Milwaukee and Madison by as large enough margin to offset losing everywhere else. And that reflects the rural and urban divide and rural and urban suspicions and distaste, mutual distaste that we see around the country. As you may have seen yesterday, the Republicans, I mentioned this earlier, the Republicans nominated Trump's candidate for governor, Mr. Michaels, over a more traditional conservative candidate, who I think will have a more difficult time winning that general election. And the Democrats nominated an extremely progressive candidate, the Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes, who I think, while I certainly won't predict a victory for the incumbent Ron Johnson, I think because Barnes is so progressive, it gives Johnson a chance at re-election that he might not have had in running against a more centrist candidate. So to wrap up, love the EAA, go Pack, and what makes Wisconsin such a bellwether is the rural and urban divide that we see almost everywhere in the country now.
It sounds to me as though we're talking a lot of inside baseball here, like, oh, who will get ahead in this race? Well, all horse race. But we have like huge constitutional issues, delaying justices, packing courts, attacks on the Capitol, massive gerrymandering. I'm not as interested in a way as who's going to win inside this game is the fact that the rules are totally broken. So how do we look at the big picture where we're not really acting in a democracy? We're acting in a
Okay, so excellent question and a totally fair one. I made a decision, particularly in the wake of the Mar-a-Lago news from a couple days ago, and given that the midterms are so close, to focus more on the news of the day, or if you will, the news of the fall. But I think your broader questions are entirely appropriate, Bill. And if I can be so presumptuous, if you would all be willing, I'd be more than happy to come back at some point and have that conversation. Marilyn, I don't mean to impose myself, but just know for the future, it is a critically important topic. What we don't have time for today is to go through the specifics of the January 6th riots. What we don't have a chance to go through today is the broader divisiveness and polarization of the US and how it drives a lot of the things you talked about. I'll offer you just a couple of thoughts. One, I'm going to recommend a book, quick visual aid for those of you who haven't yet read it. This book, The Soul of America by John Meacham.
Oh, yeah.
Is, Bill, not necessarily direct answers to your questions, but Meacham's book talks in what I think is an incredibly profound way about these challenges in a historical perspective. Here, I'll put this back up again for those of you who'd like to see it. John Meacham, The Soul of America, is published in 2017. So what Meacham argues is, he says, we haven't been here before in precisely the circumstance that Bill Day describes. He says, we haven't been here before, but we've been here before. And what the book does is it chronicles, he argues that America has periodically faced challenges of huge division and hatred as a country since even before we were a country. And he goes back through American history and not only recounts each of these previous periods, but talks about how we got through them and put the country back together. Meacham ultimately became, he's a respected historian, but over the last couple of years, he's written some speeches for Joe Biden, but it's not a partisan book. It's a book where good people of either political party or any political ideology can share Bill's concerns. And what Meacham does, like I said, is not just walk us through those past episodes, but talks about how we got through them before. And while some of them are fairly obvious, he talks about Lincoln, he talks about King and others, a lot of them involve much more improbable heroes being willing to fight to overcome these divisions. It's one of the reasons that I think so highly of Rotary, because in communities all across America, that's what you do. Not in a political context, but you remind people that what unites us is actually greater than what divides us. If we have time, I can talk a little bit more about polarization at more of a macro level. But Bill, it's a great question. And if you guys would be willing to give me the opportunity, I'd love to come back and bore you a second time at some point in the future by talking in that broader context. So I'm very glad you raised the point.
I'd love to have you come back and talk in a broader context. And I'm not bored. I just want more.
Okay. So
I wouldn't know overcoming the little glitch with the 600,000 dead was, kind of a grim moment, and you're getting through it. But yeah, thank you for the book recommendation. I'll read it. I hope you come back.
Okay, and I'll toss in 2 other book recommendations for you too. One is called We'Re Polarized by Ezra Klein, the New York Times columnist. We'Re Polarized, Ezra Klein. And the second is called Them, simply Them, by Ben Sasse, the Republican senator. I assign those books to my classes at all 3 schools, and the joke is they're the same book, just one written by a liberal columnist and the other written by a conservative senator, and both warn about the dangers of hyperpolarization leading to the kind of challenges that you talk about. So I don't think I'm allowed to give you guys assignments, but those are 3 books that I think are really good. Dr. Hancock, does he still have a hand up?
Yes. How you doing? And Daniel, thank you for being here today. Very wise insights you're sharing with us. We'd love to have you back. I don't think any of us are bored, but looking at the politics, everybody's fretting and salivating around what's going on day to day. How do we move the body politic into a long-term view of, where we are, where we need to be, the Constitution, balancing all of this out so that we actually see ourselves, even if we're disagreeing about the politics of today, even Roe versus Wade, some other very deep issues, but we're all in this together. So how do we move beyond seeing where we should be and not where we're just stuck on a day-to-day basis?
So I'll give you a couple of quick answers. One is we need more organizations like yours, or need more people to join them. Because I think one of the things that Rotary does very effectively that I've seen in California and back in Wisconsin is, as I said earlier, you remind us of the values and roots of our communities. And as I signed on a couple minutes before 9:30 my time, 12:30 your time, and I was just hearing the announcements. Now, I'm probably not going to be able to attend your party. I'm probably not going to take advantage of most of the announcements that you've offered. But every single one of those announcements reminded me about how people left, right, and center can come together on behalf of their community and things that are important to them. So I really do believe the more non-political organizations that exist in a community to bring people together are the most effective tool of fighting that partisanship. The second thing I'll offer is one of the 2 books I mentioned, Ezra Klein's We'Re Polarized. Klein talks about how we as a species, not as Americans, but as human beings, how we are a tribal species. And this has been hardwired into us since prehistoric days, when we learned that hunting in bands was a much safer way of getting food and protecting ourselves than being on our own. So this is almost chemical, biological in us now. The need to be part of a tribe. And in communities around this country, where the Rotaries and the Chamber of Commerce and the Kiwanis might not have the kind of reach that they once did, where church and synagogue attendance is down, where people are less likely to get involved in their children's schools, their tribal identity becomes more and more reliant on their political identification. So instead of me saying, I'm a Rotarian, I'm a member of the Emmanuel Synagogue, I coach Little League, and oh yeah, I'm a Democrat or Republican, more and more Americans don't do those other things anymore. And so they cling to that R and they cling to that D, so they feel like they belong to a tribe. And the more we can remind them that their identities are a lot more complicated than their political affiliation, I think the better chance we have of convincing them that the people who happen to vote for another candidate might be opponents, but not enemies. And it's not by telling them they're wrong or they're bad or they're evil or they're stupid. It's by saying, hey, yes, you're a Republican, you're a Democrat, but our kids go to school together. We pray together. We have all these things in common. And I think ultimately that's the way, as Meacham points out in his book, that we get through this.
Yeah, when I was doing, I'll get off, but when I was doing my doctoral research many years ago, I was introduced to this whole concept of tribalism in most countries around the world. And I was thinking, whew, I'm glad we don't do that in the United States. Guess what? Here we are. And so thank you for bringing that up. And when you come back, weave this narrative in of tribalism and why it's a very bad thing, but it's very real. And we need to address it openly and honestly. And Daniel, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for the nice words. One of my favorite parts of Ben Sass's book, Them, is he has a chapter called Why We Need More Identity Politics. And he makes it clear, he said, and I sort of paraphrased it a moment ago, he said, identity politics can be a great thing because our identity is, our heritage is at the core of who we are. But when we tend to identify in a singular way by our gender, by our racial or ethnic heritage, that's where we get into trouble. And his point was, the more we remind ourselves that we actually have many different identities, the more likely we are to find one where we can find commonality with someone who at first glance doesn't appear to share that experience.
Thank you. And Dan, thank you so much for agreeing to be our guest speaker this week. And on behalf of our club, I'm pleased and proud to present you with this certificate recognizing your appearance before us today and signifying our commitment to plant a tree in your honor to improve and beautify the environment. We now have GPS coordinates, so once we know where your tree will be planted, we will be sending that to you, and this will be arriving in the mail. And we also have a ceremony that we invite our speakers to, so maybe it could be in town for that.
I would love it. Thank you so much.